Hello everyone, Rachel Weaver here. I am making a series of videos in which I ask members of Lighthouse's faculty specific crafting questions. So today I've asked Paula Younger to join us. Hi Paula.
Hi Rachel.
Thanks for being here.
No, thanks for having me. It's nice to escape homeschool.
No. So the question I have for you, Paula, because I think you are especially good at it in your own writing, is how to convey emotion in a way that is impactful to the reader within a scene. So I'm hoping that you can give us a few tips, a few ways that we can start to incorporate emotion in a more integrated way into our scenes.
Thanks for asking. Obviously, it's one of my obsessions. I've taught the Creating Emotion, Avoiding Melodrama class quite a few times at Lighthouse, but just as a reader and writer, it's something I'm always fixated with. And I think just when you teach for a lot of years like I have and you get a lot of intro and intermediate students and even some of the advanced ones, people tend to skip the emotion part. And I think a lot of times I think they do it because they're afraid of seeming melodramatic, like being too over to the top. I think we're also just sometimes afraid of going to the darker places. And I think emotion is just such a tricky thing. We tend to have more than one emotion at the same time, but when we're writing, we think it just has to be anger or sadness or grief. And you forget a lot of times, I always try to remind my students, and I had to be reminded too, in my grad school, one of my friends told me, "Well, Paula, you're so funny. I forget that because you're writing so sad." I was like, "What?" So I do try to remind myself and my students too that in order to break people's hearts, you need to make them laugh. You need to make them care and be invested in your characters and be invested in the story. And I think if you do read a lot and you do edit a lot, it can start to just be like, oh, another cancer story, or oh, another tragic illness or tragic car crash. So you have to find for what makes it unique. And I have all sorts of different tips and exercises, and in my class, studying the ways different writers do it. And I think it's sometimes just solving it for your own scene. But I think a lot of times people just completely skip it. Like I had told you before, my novel, there's a gay uncle who dies from AIDS, and my first draft, I had him sick. Then I had the funeral, and I completely skipped the death part. And I just didn't want to do it. I just didn't want to go there. And I think I was afraid of doing it incorrectly. I think I was afraid of it not seeming real or honest. And I think I was also just afraid of having to go to that dark place. And so I think a lot of our students, other writers, were struggling with these things. And instead of just trying to figure out how to show that complicated emotion, we just don't do it at all together. But did I even answer your question?
Yes. But you brought up another question, which is something that plagued me forever when I first started, and I think it still plagues me. But how do you avoid melodrama?
Well, the melodrama, I think we all run into it. And I think, unfortunately, we see melodrama all the time in TV shows and movies and commercials. I was the type as a child, whenever there'd be any emotional commercial, I'd cry, and my siblings made fun of me. But those are just cheap tricks to make you feel an emotion. It's unearned. And so, it's if you see crying a lot in a draft, or yelling or screaming, we all see that with the dialogue tags. It should just normally be he said, she said. Keep it neutral and let the scene do the work, let the dialogue do the work, or else you kind of feel like you're beating somebody over the head with it. Mm-hmm. And so it's one of my red flags, but if a student or friend or myself are having crying in a text, I would circle it. And it's not that you can't have crying, but crying we use a lot of times just to be shorthand for emotion. And crying doesn't convey emotion. If you think about it for yourself, you normally cry if you're just so overwhelmed you just can't handle it, or it's just a release of emotions. Mm-hmm. And so we need to be diving into those scenes and those moments of how you're truly feeling and those different complicated emotions that you have at one particular time. And I have it in my craft sheet, but I think the Merriam-Webster definition of emotion is how you feel it in the body. And I think a lot of times what I see in early drafts for myself and in students and friends' work too, it's just all these big epiphanies or thoughts, but there's none of the work of the scene or the body of the character. And so I think it's just taking your time, staying in scene, using the resources of what is in that scene and how the character feels in their body. And also just a lot of times we're feeling one way and we say something different. So kind of that contradiction between how a character's acting and then what they're saying. And then that brings in the reader in a lot of different ways too, because we feel the complexity, we feel the danger of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of times we avoid that as writers just because we don't want to feel the super intense emotion that our character is feeling, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's always that like favorite Andre Dubus quote right here. I think it was when he was at Lighthouse. I heard him saying that like whenever he feels like he's great, he's doing really well with his writing, la la la, he looks at it later and it sucks.
Mm-hmm.
And then if he's taking his time, he's being there emotionally, and he's kind of, not that you have to feel miserable or be miserable when you're writing. That's kind of a slog. He's pushing himself to uncomfortable places. He's not sure how it's going. Then that's normally his most powerful writing. And I think the strongest scenes tend to be uncomfortable. And it's the characters are doing something uncomfortable. The person's doing something uncomfortable. It's people not behaving the best way. Charles Baxter, I think in his craft series, like he had the creating a scene. But I think we're so trained on how we have to behave every day, and it's hard to get that ingrained out of us for writing, that this is where we're not polite, this is where we're honest, this is where we represent how we really feel what's going on inside of us, because that's why we read. That's why we're going to have these experiences. It's just not the shallow, everyday, how are you? I'm fine, blah, 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 like where nothing's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it can be hard to turn that off and then turn on the complications. And, you know, I was lucky I studied with Cheryl Strayed when she was becoming famous. And I remember in our craft class, she talked about like a lot of the scenes she felt uncomfortable about, like shooting the horse, eating her dead mother's ashes.
Mm-hmm.
She was really afraid of how people would view her and think of her as a person. And it's nonfiction. She had nothing to hide behind. But she said after so many readings, people came up to her and they cited those moments as like the most powerful and where it really resonated with them. And that's where we make the real connections with our people, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, is when we're being really real and honest and diving into those embarrassing moments, those uncomfortable moments, those moments where we don't behave the right way, where we regret something we did or our characters do, or they went against what they really wanted out of that moment, because that's where we're the most human. And that's why we're reading and that's why we're writing. And so I think it's just such a loss if we're skipping that part.
Thank you. That's awesome. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Rachel. It was nice talking to you.
It's nice to see you, Paula.
Nice to see you.
See ya.